Well, welcome everyone. My name's Ann Martindale, and for the past 6 years, I've been an interpreter at the oldest house on Nantucket. And sadly, the oldest house is closed this year because of the coronavirus. But what better time to tell the story of the oldest house using our old historic photographs and all the other resources we have at hand. So the first half of our story is about the three families who actually lived in the oldest house. That would be the Coffins, the Paddocks, and the Turners. And it wasn't even called the oldest house until the mid-1850s when we had visitors stopping by all of a sudden to see this iconic symbol of old Nantucket. On December 1 of 1856, we have the first reference to the oldest house in a Nantucket newspaper. The reporter was taken on a tour by a guide, probably Mr. Turner, and he commented on the horseshoe on the chimney, the old diamond-shaped window frames that were hanging about, left around in the yard. Inside, the winding staircase that stared you in the face as soon as you entered the front door. Into the attic where there was a pigeon house. Who knew? So the reporter called it the oldest house, and the nickname stuck. Now here's the oldest house today, very much as it looked when it was built in 1686. It's facing south on Sunset Hill, 30 feet above sea level, just off Westchester Road. And it was built as a wedding gift for Jethro Coffin. He was 23, and his young bride, Mary Gardner, she was 16. And they were both descendants of two prominent Nantucket families. The Coffins had been here since day one. Tristram Coffin was one of the original proprietors. And Mary's dad, John Gardner, he was in the second group to arrive, the so-called half-share people. He was given a half share in the island. He was a cod fisherman, and he was one of the tradesmen recruited to really make Nantucket a going community. Now, these two factions, the full share people and the half share people, they feuded during the early days of the settlement. But by the time the wedding came along, this feud was over, and the two families were very focused on getting the two kids a great wedding present. So the Coffins provided the lumber for the house, and John Gardner gave them 1.5 acres of land. And tradition has it that the couple was married right in front of the fireplace in the west parlor. And further has it that Jethro's dad held up the ceremony until Mary's dad handed over the deed. So as you might guess, our earliest sources are the families themselves, not just the oral histories, but also deeds, probate records, business records, and so forth. Another great source, and my favorite source, honestly, are the old photographs we have. And we have many of them because starting in the 1860s, visitors were coming by to see this quaint little iconic symbol of old Nantucket. And they were coming by with their cameras. So in this old photograph, which is from 1867, you can see that it documents on the left, the entrance to the old root cellar in the basement. You can see the dilapidated condition of the chimney, the old well, and the old cart path along to the well. And then on the left, you see the old chicken coop, and we'll hear more about that chicken coop later. Another source was the house itself. There were major restorations done in 1881 and in 1927. With each restoration, additional secrets about the house were revealed. Now imagine you're standing in front of the house on that wedding day in 1686. This is roughly what it looked like. And you would have been dazzled because it was really a mansion for its day and really quite an impressive house with the leaded glass chimneys, the leaded glass windows, the decorated chimney. And here we see two dormers that were intended to bring light into the two upstairs bedrooms. And those, in our consultant's estimate, were taken down early in the house's history because they had the effect of kind of funneling rainwater right over the front door. So those didn't last long. And also, our consulting architect in 1927, he concluded that there was a rear lean-to that extended all the way off the back of the house. And that was where the summer kitchen and the so-called birthing room were located. So with that lean-to in the back, it became a true New England salt box shape. Now, what about that chimney? Well, there's a horseshoe on the chimney, and there are several stories. It represents good luck, or it represents bad luck because it's upside down. It represents the union of the two families, or it's intended to keep the witches away, which isn't completely surprising because the Salem witchcraft trials were just a few years later. Or it's just a nice decoration, or, and this is my favorite, that it was intended to pour the good luck down on the young couple. Then off to the right of the chimney, we have the scuttle. That was so you could go into your attic and get up on your chimney, get up on your roof to maintain the chimney. And also, if you had to put out a chimney fire, you would have kept buckets and bags. Try not to fall off the roof and pour the sand down the chimney. So that was it for chimney fires. Now, if you were standing in that front yard back then and looked to the west, you might have seen the original settlement. It was called Sherburne. It wasn't called Nantucket until much later. And Sherburne was where the settlers originally built their homes, right around Capalm Harbor, which as you can see at the top of the map. And the Coffins and Tristram Coffin and his son, they took the prime real estate around the harbor. And everybody else kind of staked out home sites along a Westchester Road, which is shown as Nantucket Road on this map. But Westchester Road was really the main road back in the day. Next slide, please. And if you look to the east, towards the downtown, this is a more recent watercolor, but you really wouldn't have seen much of anything. The downtown simply did not exist. To the east, you would have just seen the Great Harbor and maybe glimpsed some of the sheep that were there. There were 10,000 sheep on the island then, because Nantucket, in addition to being a farming town, was trying to make itself into a town that produced textiles, but that really just didn't work. So the downtown didn't really come into being until the early 1720s. And it was then that the Capalm Harbor was closed up by a series of storms, and the settlers actually dismantled their houses and brought them and reassembled them in the new downtown, where the downtown is today. So this is the old fireplace in the East Parlor. Now, Mary and Jethro would have spent most of their time in here. It wasn't an easy life. Mary would have done all her cooking in front of this fireplace. She had 8 children, 6 of them lived to adulthood. Jethro would have been out all day on his various occupations, which include helping with the family lumber business, but also some shore whaling, also some farming, which we know from his business receipts for plowing and blacksmithing work he had done. And then in 1708, Jethro's father gave him the rights to 240 acres in Mendon, Mass, about 40 miles west of Boston. So after living in the house 22 years, the couple sold the house and moved to Mendon. In Mendon, Mary had her portrait painted, and here she is. She was about 47 when she had this done, and it was done by an anonymous painter known as the Pollard Limner. He's anonymous, but he's famous for doing about 20 portraits, all in this style, all in the Boston area. And he's called the Pollard Limner, or painter, because one of his paintings was of a lady called Anne Pollard. So this portrait stayed in the family, and Mary, when she finally came back to Nantucket after Jethro's death, she moved in with her son, one of her sons, on Cliff Road, Portrait's still in the family. Mary dies at 97, age 97. And then eventually in 1924, the family donated the portrait to the NHA, and it's now the oldest portrait in our collection. We're back at the oldest house, and the next family to move in was the Parlor family, and they were actually stayed there with their many, many, many children for 132 years. The first, excuse me, I said Parlor, I meant Paddock. And so the first person there was Nathaniel Paddock. He was actually a weaver and the brother of Ichabod Paddock, who had been hired by Nantucket as a professional whaler. So Nathaniel Paddock moves in. He has one child. He has 9 more. And after a certain amount of time goes by, these 2 children, Daniel and Paul, build a house right in the front yard. So this isn't the oldest house, even though it looks just like it, almost just like it. This is the Paddock house. So for quite a while, this house was sitting right up on Sunset Hill in front of the oldest house. And so when Nathaniel died, generation 1 dies, then Paul, his son, moves in. He stays in the oldest house for 40 some years. And then finally, we have a 3rd generation of Paddocks in the house, another Nathaniel, and he's there until 1840. And just 4 days after the second Nathaniel Paddock dies, his son sells the house. So 4 generations, 132 years, lots and lots of children, and the house is sold for $300. Now, by then, the house is about 150 years old, and it is not doing that well. It was sold to a cooper or barrel maker, and his name was George Turner. So here's George right here with his wife, Mary, and 3 of their many children. And we know a lot about what George did here because his granddaughter, Harriet, was the youngest child born, was the last child to be born at the oldest house. She was born there in 1854. And some years later, in 1928, she wrote a letter to the NHA describing exactly how the condition of the house when her grandfather bought it and some of the work he did. So George Turner, shown here, he took off the front porch and he's the one who moved it to the backyard and made it into a chicken coop. And his other big project was to put this little peephole right to the side of the door. And here's a close-up of the peephole. There's Mary Turner and there's George again. And so we know that the peephole was not a so-called Indian peephole, which was how the Enquirer Mirror described it for years and years. But it wasn't an Indian peephole. It was just simply a window that George installed to get additional light in the front hall. And that's the story of the peephole. By 1867, though, the condition of the house had just gotten the best of George, and the whaling industry had collapsed. He decided to become a farmer and move out. So he did. He moved his family onto a house on Cliff Street and began using the oldest house for the storage of hay. Now, you've already heard how George used to give tours of the house. He was so famous for giving tours, it was in fact mentioned in his obituary. So when he dies in 1874, you hear all about his skills as a house tour guide. And then his wife, it's 1875, and she says, wait a minute, that was a great idea. She actually converts the East Parlor into a museum. And that's what we see here in this slide, an old stereoscope card showing the East Parlor as a museum. Now you're saying, well, what happened to the big fireplace? Well, by then, those big fireplaces were passé, and this was a fireplace that had been downsized, and here we have the stuffed dummy and the spinning wheel and the whole thing. And so in 1875, Mary was very proud to tell the newspaper that 650 people had paid to visit the oldest house museum that summer. And she maintained that museum for another few years, just based on what I can tell from the newspapers. But let's see, Yeah, so it was time, but by 1881, it was time for the old house to be rescued. And the Coffins would do that. The Coffin family came along and would rescue it, as they did, at least on 2 occasions. So fortuitously, the Coffin family was planning its big reunion for August of 1881. Now here they all are, 500, they all signed up, and it was quite a big deal. They came, all 500 of them, from all parts of the world. On day one, they took the new Nantucket Railroad out to Surfside and had a big clam bake, had a big family portrait, which is here, and that family portrait was sold all over town. You could, if you wanted to buy this picture, you could. Day 2, the Coffins went out for a little field trip to visit the original settlement at Kaufman. And day 3, they had a big grand ball. Now, here we go. Here's your ticket for the event. Notice that it's called the Clan Coffin Memorial Reunion. It was really quite a big deal. So there were prominent Nantucket speakers. Those included the suffragette Anna Gardner and the Reverend Phoebe Hannaford, who Anna presented a paper. Phoebe read one of her poems. And if you want to hear more about those 2 women, there's a wonderful exhibit on the Whaling Museum right now on the suffragettes. But the featured speaker was Tristram Coffin, and he was an attorney from Poughkeepsie, and he gave the principal speech. It was an elaborate genealogy telling all about how the Coffins had descended from more Coffins in Devonshire, England. So Tristram Coffin of Poughkeepsie and his brother headed out to the oldest house site, and they were just appalled to see the condition it was in. You can see there were holes in the roof. It was all boarded up. The chimney was crumbling, and it was pretty much a disaster. In the back of the house, this is a rare picture of the back of the house, but the old summer kitchen had burned down at some point, we don't quite know when. The old birthing room is still there on the west side of the house. So they were absolutely determined to buy this house and preserve it. They tracked down Mrs. Turner, paid her $300, and they moved very quickly. The deed for this house was signed only 9 days after the end of the reunion. Now, they immediately went about to preserve the house, to protect it on the outside. They patched the chimney, they put on a new roof, they reshingled it, because honestly, the shingles had been a lot of the shingles had been pulled off by tourists as souvenirs. So they fixed the outside of the house up, and they had a little chat with the Nantucket newspaper. They talked about the interesting things they discovered. They said that in the mortar, the shell mortar, under the U in the chimney, they discovered the initials carved in the mortar. The initials were J.C., Jethro Coffin. In the attic, they said they encountered the year 1686 carved in the mortar inside the attic. And I'm sorry to say, both of those pieces of mortar fell off in the renovations, but they did encounter those. And they also reported that they found charred timbers and also an extra chimney flue pointing out where the old summer kitchen had been. So there's sort of a discussion about, was there really a summer kitchen? And yes, there was, as evidenced by this chimney flue and at least one other piece of evidence we'll talk about in a minute. So they did this exterior restoration. Then they closed up the house for 3 years, opened it up again in 1886 for the house's 200th anniversary, and then they closed it for another 11 years. So now it's sort of official. After a significant amount of pressure, Tristram Coffin decides, yes, he really will open up the oldest house again. So in 1887, he hired a custodian, Ellen Bartlett, who ran a boarding school in his hometown of Poughkeepsie. She was custodian, and he ran this ad in the paper. It's now officially, quote, the oldest house. a very dignified ad saying the house is open for public inspection. And he ran it starting in July of 1897 and every week after that through Labor Day. And he ran it again the next year. Next year, it mentioned there would be an admission charge of 15 cents. So what did the visitors see when they went in here in 1897? We do have a series of photos from that time. And this is the East Parlor, the Great Hall, or whatever you choose to call it. And those of you who've been in the oldest house lately, this won't look familiar at all, but that's how it was when the Coffins bought it. There was a federal style paneling around the fireplace, which had obviously been made quite a bit smaller. And he did not, Mr. Coffin did not remove this. He also left the old oak floorboards in place, the timbers. He didn't really make a lot of changes in this particular room. Over in the West Parlor, he told the newspaper he was thrilled to discover what was the quote? Delighted with the discovery of an old-fashioned fireplace that had been built up. So he did take off the old paneling in the West Parlor, and this is what visitors saw at that time. Now, those of you who know the oldest house know there was a little nook to the left of the fireplace and a couple of more small doors that went into the rear lean-to section of the house. Those are still covered up, and those would not be revealed until the restoration of 1927. Upstairs, he didn't do much of anything. This is the upstairs bedroom on the west side, not in the greatest of shape. We see the original fireplace. We see the closet, which was quite an unusual and desirable thing for that time. And the other thing visitors saw up in this bedroom was, and I really don't understand this for the life of me, but John Gardner's tombstone had been removed from its original site in 1881 and put in this bedroom chamber. So they would have seen John Gardner's tombstone also. Now, who's this? This is Anna Starbuck Jenks. So if you were visiting the oldest house in 1899 or any other summer after that for the next 24 years, you would have been met by Mrs. Jenks. She was born on Nantucket, came back every summer for the next 24 years. And during her first summer, she was a little starstruck when Mrs. Grover Cleveland came to visit. And she wrote a big letter to the paper describing the visit and called Mrs. Cleveland, quote, a ray of sunshine that warms the heart. So that was a big moment. And she stayed there as custodian for the next 25 summers, retiring in 1923. When she retired, she was 75. Tristram Coffin was 85. And it seemed like a really good time to sell the oldest house. And so they did. They sold it in 1923 to the NHA for $3,500. And Mr. Coffin was kind enough to take back a mortgage for $2,000 of that. Then the NHA really got going, a big fundraising campaign. And once again, the Coffins stepped forward with the funds to restore the house. That would be Winston Coffin. He was a investment banker from Boston, and he said, I'll give you the money for the house to restore it completely, to kind of roll back the clock to the way it had been, if you do it all under the direction of the New England Society for the Preservation of Antiquities. That was a Boston organization, very important. And their supervising architect was this gentleman you see in the front of the picture, Alfred Shuriks. And he was pretty amazing. This was sort of his dream project. I sense this was his huge project. He took many photographs, documented lots of things to demonstrate what the house had been originally, how the house had looked originally. So here he is. They're just getting started. They've taken off all the shingles, and they're starting to remove the material around the chimney. The chimney restoration here is underway. Turns out there was no real foundation built under the chimney, and it was tilting 8 inches towards the west. So they had to encase it in steel beams, move it back to a true perpendicular, repair the mortar, and finally they got that squared away. And then underneath the house, the foundation had to be rebuilt and new sills had to be installed. Out in the back of the house, they restored the lean-to. So rather than just the little birthing room sticking out, we now have the complete lean-to stretching across the back of the house, and with the birthing room on the west and a restored summer kitchen that we'll see in a minute on the east. So now we have the house back to its original footprint, 39 feet by 30.5 feet. And it's a classic center chimney colonial. You probably already knew that, but there it is with the center chimney and fireplaces, which include fireplaces that face into all of the major rooms. And this would be the predominant house plan in New England up until around 1725, when then the next big idea, the center hall house, became popular. So you had a center hall that was wide open, and then the chimneys would be usually on the sides of the house. So here's that summer kitchen we've been talking about. It looked like this. We have a beautiful series of postcards by Mary Gardner. And this is what they believe the summer kitchen looked like. And it's obviously a big fireplace, but behind that, a huge beehive oven. Boarded over during this restoration. So there's further proof now that there truly was a summer kitchen there with a beehive oven. And then this is also the, they've taken the paneling off in the east parlor or the great hall. And this is the fireplace pretty much as you'll see it today also. So now for Mr. Shuriks' most controversial decision, we have the leaded windows. Now that was a big to-do at the time. No one had really seen these, but Mr. Shuriks, as he was investigating the house, he discovered that the old case, let's see, the windows had actually been made larger to accommodate the sash windows that we've seen all along in these old photos. But he said, well, first of all, they didn't have sash windows back when this house was built. These casement windows with the leaded glass would have been absolutely what you would have had then. And also he mentioned the enlarged window openings, and he probably didn't have the chance to read that little newspaper article from 1856 where it described the old leaded windows kind of lying around, discarded and lying around the yard. So everything was great, and the house continued to welcome visitors until October 1 of 1987, when it was struck by lightning. You can see what a disaster it was. The chimney was blown off. The east roof just slid right off the house. The blow was so intense that the house shifted on its foundation. Mercifully, no one was inside, but it was quite a project to restore it to what it had been. It took 3 years. And so in 1990, in June of 1990, the house reopened to the public with, of course, the new lightning rods on either side. So last year, we welcomed more than 4,000 visitors to the oldest house. And this, I have to say, is, I think, my favorite photo. It's from 1914. Mrs. Alice Shibley and her daughter Marion are visiting the oldest house from Washington, D.C. So if it's 1914, we know they would have been met by Mrs. Jenks, who would have given them a very informative tour. So that's your tour for today. If you have questions, I'm very happy to give it a try.
Hi there, Anne.
Hi there.
So we've had a question come in. Were the Paddocks and the Turners also Quakers?
You know, the Paddocks, some of the Paddocks were Quakers. And there's some documentation in the meeting house records of the time. I don't think all of them were, but some of them were. I don't know about the Turners.
Thank you. That's the only question we have right now. So if anyone else would like to submit questions, we're happy to present them. Oh, great. So what was the town that Jethro and Mary Coffin moved to?
Oh, they moved to Mendon, Massachusetts. And he actually bought a farm there. And then towards the end of his life, he became a blacksmith.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions for Anne? Oh, another has come in. Have you heard of any plans for a coffin reunion in the next few years?
I have not, but that's not to say it's not a good idea. There were quite a few coffin reunions after that. And if you go to our website and click research and then you find yourself in the old photos, you can see pictures of these various reunions that have taken place. I would say, every 20, 30 years, something like that. But they do get together from time to time. And I will say, since I don't have any questions, that every so often I get somebody visiting at the oldest house. There was a 12-year-old boy who introduced himself as Tristram Coffin and said he was from Texas. So those coffins are definitely around and visiting.
So we've had a few more questions come in, Anne. What types of animals were there originally at the oldest house? This asker has said that they saw some sheep there last year. That is true. Is that what they used to have at the time of the coffins?
Well, there was an assortment of. It was pretty typical for a family to have like one horse, maybe a cow or two, lots of sheep. And there was a whole structure about how many of each type you could have, so you wouldn't exhaust the grazing land on the island. And we do know, we have some bills where Jethro actually paid to shoe a horse, so I think it's safe to say he had a horse, and he paid someone to plow for him, so he certainly would have needed a horse for that.
Wonderful, thank you. Do you know if this is the Jethro Coffin House, so is the Coffin House on Center Street? How are they related?
I can't tell you that. I don't know that.
That's a good question.
I can tell you about the Jared Coffin House,
Sorry, yes,
the restaurant. I think that's like 6 or 7 generations. They are related, but that's a number of generations later. But that is a direct descendant of these coffins.
Sure, that makes sense. So we've had a question here saying that I saw Indian lands on one of the maps. How long was there a native presence on the island?
Well, make that forever. The best guess is the Wampanoag arrived about 8,000 years ago, and that's before Nantucket was an island. They actually came down here when we were not an island, and they settled here, and they were here really forever. The old story is that the last Wampanoag to live here was Dorcas Honorable, who died in 1855. But there's some new research that Fran Cartoonen has done, and it was really more complicated than that. They intermarried with the African-American families on the island, and then some of the Wampanoag people came over from Martha's Vineyard and settled here, so it wasn't cut and dried.
So we have a great question here. This is a descendant of a Coffin family asking, is there more family information at the museum? Can one learn more about the Coffins there?
Well, just make that a ton of information. I have to say the NHA research, the research materials online at nha.org are just astonishing. And there's all sorts of documents and photos, and there's almost no end to it. And what I want to thank, might as well thank them right now. Since 2012, all the Nantucket newspapers have been online. at act.net and also at the Athenaeum website. And I really had a great time using them to prepare this. I would say that if you go onto act.net or the Athenaeum site, you can pull up, you can type in the name coffin, type in a date framework, and pull up every single newspaper article that was written with the word coffin in it. And it's really quite a few. It's almost like a bottomless pit. So go for it.
Yeah, it's truly an invaluable resource. After the lightning strike in 1987, was the NHA able to salvage the original parts of the house, or did they reconstruct the damaged parts?
Well, as I'm sure you know, they made it a priority to salvage every last speck of wood that they could, and every brick and everything. They really tried to preserve as much as they could. One time there was an exhibit there showing how they had resurrected beams with powder post beetles in them by inserting metal and fiberglass inserts. So they really took every care. It was about a 3-year project. They took every care to restore every bit as much as they could. And the main structure is still there. I mean, the oak beams you see in that house, most of them are from day one.
Great, so we have a few interesting questions here about the structure of the house. When was the root cellar entrance removed from the outside?
I can't say I know that. I know it was there in that 1867 photo, but if you look at some of the later photos, it's not there anymore. So I don't know. It may have just been, I just can't guess.
So what exactly is a summer kitchen?
Well, the summer kitchen was designed so you would have a cool place on the north shady side of the house to cook during the summer without heating up the rest of the house. So it was really a luxury, honestly. So, and you would have access, there's a garden out back, and that garden would be very handy because there's a door right from the summer kitchen into the garden, and it's really a wonderful room.
So building off of that, what was the birthing room used for when no women were expecting?
Well, it could be used for a variety of things. It could be a guest room. It could be a room for a sick child. It was just it was almost like a utility room. When you go in there, you're going to see on that wall the so-called cradle boards, the big thick boards that were traditionally put on the wall. So if the cradle rocked against the wall, it wouldn't damage the plaster. But it did have other uses. It was a private bedroom for a variety of things, nicknamed the birthing room.
From where would they have acquired their furniture and other essentials not made on island?
Well, you got me on that. I hate to guess about things, but there were some furniture makers on the island, and then of course they probably would have gotten them from, mainland Massachusetts, but I'm guessing. I hate to guess.
Sure. Was the lumber for the original house cut on the island, or did it come from the mainland?
No, it would have come from the Coffin family forests in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And I didn't go into this, but the Coffins were in the lumber business, and that was pretty sly because they essentially recruited people to this island where there were very few trees. So most of the lumber for the house came from offshore, from the mainland.
Great, and we have time for just one last question. So if the first few families arrived on Nantucket in 1659, are there older houses that still exist on the island?
Well, I have to say that there's probably at least one older house, and that would be Old Lang Syne in Sconset. Now you can get into a little bit of a fight about was it really a house or was it just a cottage, like many old cottages in Sconset, put up as a whale house so that the people who were hanging out in Sconset looking for whales and could stay there. You'd have usually 6 guys on a team. People be sleeping in the house, but one guy would always be on lookout for whales. So the several old homes in Wisconsin, but the oldest, Old Lang Syne, 1675, and it is still there. And unlike other old homes in Wisconsin, it has not been moved around. We think it was always there.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions we have time for tonight.
Well, thanks so much. And I want to thank everyone who was watching the webinar. I hope it was fun. I had a good time preparing for it. And I also want to thank our members. They support programs like this and so much else that we do. So thank you all for watching.